There's something about the water. We need it to live, and we've always been terrified of it. Too much, and it destroys everything in its path. Too little, and we die slowly. And in the early 1900s, the American West had both problems at once: flooding, drought, and a river that refused to be controlled. So we tried to control it anyway. This is the story of the Hoover Dam and one of the greatest engineering feats in American history, and the bodies, secrets, and sacrifices buried beneath it. Welcome to Meals To Unalive For, the podcast where true crime, dark history, and food collide. I'm your host, Jody Breton, and every week we serve up the stories that are as disturbing as they are fascinating, paired with the meal inspired by the chaos. So grab a plate, lock your doors, and let's dig in. Today, we'll be making a pepper jelly salmon, sweet potato mash, asparagus, and a white chocolate panna cotta. Before the dam, there was the Colorado River, wild, unpredictable, and violent. It carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, which tells you everything you need to know about how little it cared about human plans. In the early 1900s, towns along the river lived in constant fear. Some years, the river would dry up into something barely recognizable. Other years, it would flood so badly it wiped entire communities off the map. Crops were destroyed, homes vanished overnight, and people died. So naturally, the government decided, let's stop a force of nature. Construction began in 1931, right in the middle of the Great Depression, which meant thousands of desperate men showed up for work. Not because it was safe, not because it paid well, but because it was something. At the Hoover Dam, wages depended on the job, but not nearly as much as you'd expect. A general laborer hauling materials, mixing concrete, working in that brutal desert heat made about $4 a day. Skilled workers like carpenters, mechanics, electricians made a little more, around 5 to 560. And the high scalers, the men hanging hundreds of feet above the canyon with nothing but a rope around their waist, they were at the top, about $5.60 a day. That's it. The most dangerous job on site paid barely more than the others. All of this was happening during the Great Depression when people were so desperate for work, they didn't have the luxury of saying no. So imagine that. You're standing on the edge of a canyon, 800 feet down, rock falling around you, one rope between you and death. And the difference between your job and the safest one on site is about a dollar. $1 a day. About $22 difference by today's standards. That's what the risk was worth. When people look at the Hoover Dam today, it feels permanent, like it took decades to build. It didn't. From start to finish, it just took 5 years. In 1930, the contract was awarded to a group called Six Companies, Inc. They were given 7 years to complete the dam. They finished in 5. Because from the beginning, everything about this project was rushed. By 1931, workers had had enough. Low pay, dangerous conditions, extreme heat. They went on strike, demanding better conditions. The response was force. Authorities shut it down quickly because the dam wasn't just a construction project, it was a symbol. And symbols don't get delayed, no matter the cost. Before they could build anything, they had to move the Colorado River itself. 4 massive diversion tunnels were blasted through the canyon walls, each one about 56 feet in diameter. Men working deep inside those tunnels, drilling and blasting rock, breathing in dust and fumes with almost no protection. By late 1932, the river was successfully rerouted. That alone would have been considered a massive project, but for them, it was just step 1. Once the river was diverted, crews began preparing the canyon floor. This meant clearing loose rock from the walls, which is where the high scalers came in, excavating down to the solid bedrock, pouring the first concrete at the base. The first official concrete pour happened in June 1933. From here on out, there was no slowing down. This is where the scale becomes hard to grasp. The dam wasn't poured as one solid piece. If it had, it would have taken over 100 years to cool. Instead, they built it in interlocking blocks, each one carefully poured, cooled, and fitted together. At peak construction, thousands of cubic yards of concrete were poured daily. Work ran 24 hours a day, crews rotated constantly, day and night. It became a machine one that didn't stop. By 1935, 2 years early, the dam structure was essentially complete. President Franklin D. Roosevelt came to dedicate it in the summer of that year, even though finishing work and power systems continued to 1936. The major construction phase was done, 5 years in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Now, before there was Boulder City, there was a rag town. And it wasn't a town, it was a survival camp, one in the Nevada desert just miles from the Hoover Dam. Families lived in tents made from scrap canvas and wood. No running water, no electricity, no real shelter from the heat. And the heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Temperatures climbed past 120 degrees. The ground burned, the air didn't move. Dust storms rolled through the camp like they were alive. This was during the Great Depression, so for a lot of these families, this wasn't a choice. It was really the only option they had. Women stayed behind while the men went into the canyon, raising children in tents, trying to keep food from spoiling, trying to keep their kids from getting sick, and every morning they watched the men leave, and every evening they waited to see who came back, because not all of them did. There are accounts of illness spreading through the camp, of children dying in the heat, of families living in conditions so harsh that survival itself became a daily fight. Ragtown wasn't part of the official story. It doesn't show up in the photos they like to share, but it should. Because while the dam was being built in concrete and steel, Ragtown was where the cost of it was felt, quietly and daily, by the people who had no choice but to endure it. Before the concrete was even poured, people started dying. The first recorded death was a surveyor named J.G. Tierney. He drowned in the Colorado River in 1922 while scouting the site. A tragic accident, but here's where things get eerie. Exactly 13 years later, on the same date, his son, Patrick Tierney, died while working on the same dam. He fell from one of the intake towers. Same river, same project, father and son, bookends of a death toll of at least 96. Working conditions were brutal, but the real killer was the heat. Workers were climbing steel structures, drilling into canyon walls, pouring concrete, all while the desert tried to cook them alive. Men collapsed mid-shift. Some died of heat stroke before they even hit the ground. Others were pulled out of tunnels, unconscious or worse. The canyon walls had to be cleared before construction could even begin, so men were sent over the edge, literally. These were the high scalers we mentioned earlier, hung from ropes hundreds of feet in the air, with jackhammers in their hands, knocking loose rock so it wouldn't crush workers below. No harnesses, no real safety systems, just a rope tied around your waist, and another man holding the other end. Falling rocks were constant. Some workers below were struck and killed instantly. Others never even saw what hit them. To protect themselves, high scalers started coating cloth hats in tar, creating the earliest version of hard hats, because skull fractures were just part of the job. We previously mentioned the massive diversion tunnels through solid rock, and inside those tunnels, there was no ventilation, heavy machinery, and exhaust fumes. Men worked surrounded by carbon monoxide. They got dizzy, confused, then they collapsed. Officially, many of these deaths were labeled as pneumonia, but workers knew the truth. They called it something else, gas sickness. And they were right, because admitting workers were dying from toxic exposure would have meant shutting the project down. So instead, it was written off quietly. Not all deaths were hidden, some were impossible to ignore. Men fell from dizzying heights into the canyon below, others were crushed by machinery, some were swept away from the river, never recovered. Official numbers say around 96 construction deaths happened, but many historians believe the real number is much higher, because not every death was counted, and not every worker was documented, especially the most vulnerable ones. There's something strange about where Hoover Dam sits, not just geographically, but legally, because right down the middle of the dam runs a state line. On one side is Nevada, on the other side is Arizona. Two different states, two different systems. And in the 1930s, two very different ideas about what a life was worth. When workers died during construction, and they did, Their families could sometimes receive compensation, but here's the problem: there was no single unified system, no federal standard. What a family received depended on where the death was recorded. Nevada and Arizona didn't always match. Rules were different, payouts could vary, and the process itself could be inconsistent, slow, or denied altogether. Now, this is where the story starts to blur. You'll sometimes hear a darker version that if a man died near the border, his coworkers might move the body just far enough to make sure his family got the better payout, dragging him across an invisible line for the sake of a few more dollars. It's a haunting image, but there's no solid record that this was common practice. No official documentation, no verified cases. But here's the thing: even if that part isn't proven, it feels believable because the system itself made people think that way. Imagine it: you're working in the brutal heat, you've seen men fall, you know it could be you tomorrow, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you're thinking, if something happens to me, what happens to my family? And the answer depends on where you fall, on which side of an invisible line your body lands. That's the part that sticks. Not whether bodies were moved, but that the system made it matter. That even in death, location could determine value. Because the dam wasn't just divided water, it was dividing responsibility. And for the men who built it, that line wasn't just on a map. It was the difference between taken care of and being forgotten. Many of the men building the dam were migrants, drifters, desperate laborers, men who had nothing and no one looking for them. When they died, sometimes there was no family to notify, no one to question the cause, no one to push back, so their deaths disappeared just as easily as they did. You've probably heard the rumor that workers who died were buried in the dam itself, encased in concrete forever. It's a chilling thought, but here's the truth: it's very unlikely. Not because it didn't happen anywhere else in history, but because of how the dam was built. Concrete was poured in blocks, layer by layer. If a body had been left inside, it would have weakened the structure, and that would have been unacceptable. So while the image is haunting, it's probably not real. But honestly, the truth is already dark enough. Workers didn't just build the dam. Eventually, they were able to leave the ragtown behind, but the new town was government controlled: Boulder City. No alcohol, strict rules, constant oversight. It was meant to be orderly. But to many workers, it felt like control on top of control. You worked where they told you, lived where they told you, and followed rules designed to keep things quiet, even when things weren't okay. One of the town's hotels, the Boulder Dam Hotel, is also notoriously haunted. We had the privilege to spend the night there and do a paranormal investigation, which is also posted to our channel. Boulder City wasn't the only place shaped by the Hoover Dam. Some towns didn't rise with it. Some disappeared. One of those was St. Thomas, Nevada. Founded in 1865 by Mormon settlers, St. Thomas was never supposed to be part of Nevada at all. When the settlers arrived, they believed they were still in Utah or Arizona territory. If they had known the truth, they probably would have kept going. Because once the borderlines were corrected, Nevada stepped in, and with it came taxes the residents had never planned for. Many families struggled to pay, some left, but the ones who stayed built lives there: homes, farms, a community in the desert. And then came the dam. When plans for the Hoover Dam moved forward, it became clear that St. Thomas sat directly in the path of what would become Lake Mead. The government offered compensation. Some people accepted, others refused to leave, holding on to their homes for as long as they could, because this wasn't just land, it was everything that they had. By 1938, the water was rising. Slow at first, then unstoppable. The last resident, a man named Hugh Lord, stayed until the very end. As the water reached his doorstep, he got into a boat and paddled away from his home, and according to local accounts, set it on fire as he left. Watching it burn as the lake swallowed what remained, St. Thomas disappeared beneath the surface. A town erased not by time but by design, and for years it stayed there, underwater, preserved, and silent. until the lake began to recede. In 1945, then again in 1963, and decades later when the water dropped low enough, the ruins came back. Stone walls, foundations, the outline of a town that shouldn't have vanished, like it was trying to remind people it was still there. Because Hoover Dam didn't just create power, it created loss, and St. Thomas was one of the things it took with it. When it was finished in 1936, Hoover Dam was massive, 726 feet tall, over 600 feet thick at the base, holding back Lake Mead, one of the largest reservoirs in the United States. It powered cities, controlled floods, and changed the West forever. And it worked. That's the part that makes the story complicated, because it did what it was supposed to do. Behind the dam sits Lake Mead, a man made lake. Beautiful and calm, but when the water levels drop, it reveals things. Over the years, bodies have been discovered in the lake. Some victims of accidents, others something darker. Mob ties, disappearances, cold cases resurfacing decades later. It's like the water kept secrets until it doesn't. Workers used to say the canyon felt alive, like it was watching them, listening. Some reported hearing voices in the tunnels. Others felt like they weren't alone, even when they were. Today, visitors still report strange feelings, cold spots, echoes that don't make sense, that unmistakable sensation. And honestly, it's not surprising considering the bodies found in Lake Mead and the deaths associated with Hoover Dam. Here's the thing about the Hoover Dam: it represents control over nature, over water, over chaos. But control always comes with a cost. And in this case, the cost was human. Men who risked everything for a paycheck, families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers, stories that were simplified or erased in favor of progress. We look at the dam today and we see something impressive, something powerful, and something permanent. But underneath all that concrete is a story we don't talk about enough. Not just of innovation, but of sacrifice, of silence, and of the people who were left behind, so the rest of the world could move forward. Because sometimes the things we built to protect ourselves are also monuments to what we are willing to lose. By the late 1930s, the Hoover Dam wasn't just a marvel anymore, it was also a target. Because across the ocean, war was already beginning to take shape. And even before the United States officially entered World War II, American intelligence started hearing something unsettling. There had been discussions, plans even linked to Nazi agents about targeting major U.S. infrastructure. And one of the most valuable targets in the entire Southwest was Hoover Dam. Why? Because this wasn't just a wall holding back water, it powered cities. At full power, Hoover Dam can light up over 1 million homes, all from water forced through concrete at unimaginable pressure. It fueled growth, and more importantly, it powered industry. Factories in Southern California, including aircraft manufacturing plants, relied heavily on electricity generated by the dam. Take that out, and you don't just have a flood in the desert, you cripple production. You slow down war efforts before they even fully begin. Now, was there a fully operational Nazi strike team on the way? No, there's no confirmed evidence of that. But the threat was taken seriously enough that the government didn't hesitate. Because if there's something history shows us, it's that infrastructure becomes a weapon the moment war begins. So security tightened hard. Boats entering Black Canyon were restricted, movement around the dam was monitored, workers were watched more closely. The dam, once a symbol of progress, became something else entirely, a guarded asset. And then came December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Everything changed overnight. The United States was officially at war. In Hoover Dam, it was no longer just at risk. It was critical. The government shut it down to the public completely. No visitors, no tourism, no unnecessary access. Only essential personnel were allowed anywhere near it, because now the fear wasn't hypothetical, it was real. Imagine it, this massive structure in the middle of the desert, quiet, guarded, and watched over a reservoir that powered the war machine. And here's the unsettling part: if the dam had been successfully attacked, the damage wouldn't have just been local. It would have rippled outwards, through power grids, through factories, through the war effort itself. Because by the 1940s, Hoover Dam wasn't just holding back water anymore, it was holding up a piece of the country, and that made it worth protecting at all costs. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all. Not the idea that someone wanted to destroy it, but that everyone understood exactly what would happen if they did. It wasn't just the workers who died at the Hoover Dam either. On January 3rd, 1979, just outside the Hoover Dam, a body was found. Not in the water, not deep in the canyon, but down an embankment off Highway 93, like someone had simply thrown her away. Hoover Dam security officers were the ones who found her. She had been dead less than 12 hours, shot twice, once in the abdomen and once in the head with a .38 caliber weapon. At the time, no one knew who she was. No ID, no missing persons report. No one was looking for her, so she became a Jane Doe. It would take 2 years before investigators learned her name. Marion Barry Uma, 25 years old, originally from Ohio, and not just anyone. She was the granddaughter of Lauren Barry, the founder of the Yellow Pages empire, a fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions, and she stood to inherit around 40 million. The twist? Her grandfather died in 1980, not knowing she was already dead. Before her death, Marion's life had taken a strange turn. She had lived in Africa, working as a physical education teacher, married there, then separated, returned to the US, and ended up in Las Vegas. But when she got there, she didn't live like someone with money. She rented a small apartment, fell behind on rent, was asked to leave. She withdrew money from the bank in the late 1978, and then she vanished. No one knows where she went after December 13th. There's one detail investigators still come back to. A witness driving near the dam around 3 a.m. saw a vehicle, powder blue, mid 70s Chevrolet Blazer or Ford Bronco, parked strangely, backed up to the guardrail, license plate partially covered. No one was visible, no movement, just a car, sitting in the dark near where her body would have been found hours later. No suspects were ever identified, no clear motive, and even today, investigators say they don't believe her wealth was the reason she was killed, which raises a darker question. If it wasn't the money, then what was it? A woman worth millions, living like she had nothing, found dead on the edge of one of the most powerful structures in America, and 45 years later, no one knows who pulled the trigger. Unfortunately, some of the deaths at Hoover Dam are not an accident. At the Hoover Dam, there's a line you're not supposed to cross. Not officially, not safely, but over the years, people have stepped over it anyway. There's no single, publicly confirmed total of suicides at Hoover Dam, but multiple documented cases exist across decades. Most involve falls from the top of the dam or nearby structures. Authorities don't always release details, especially in more recent years. So, unlike construction deaths, these stories are scattered, quiet, and often unreported. The drop from the top of the dam is over 700 feet. That's not a fall you survive. People who jump don't hit the water the way you'd imagine. At that height, the surface hits like concrete. And below, you're not just dealing with water, you're dealing with intake structures, rock, and violent currents. Rescue is rarely possible. Recovery isn't always immediate. Part of what makes this difficult to document is jurisdiction. The dam sits between Nevada and Arizona, involves federal oversight, local law enforcement, dam security. Cases can be recorded differently depending on where the person jumped, where they were found, whether recovery was possible, which means there isn't one clean list of names, just incidents. Because of this history, safety has changed. Today, there are higher guardrails and barriers, increased security presence, surveillance monitoring activity on the dam, all meant to stop people from reaching that edge. Hoover Dam was built to control a river, but it couldn't control everything. Because for some people, the danger wasn't the fall, it was what brought them there in the first place. Behind the Hoover Dam sits something that looks calm, still, quiet, and almost peaceful. But that water, that's Lake Mead. And Lake Mead has a habit of giving things back. As I said earlier, Lake Mead did not exist before the Hoover Dam, which makes it even more unsettling when the lake recedes and it shows us the remains of people that were never meant to be found. For decades, it was the perfect place to make someone disappear, which makes it even more unsettling, is when these bodies are coming back, not because of an investigation, not because someone talked. In May of 2022, as water levels dropped to historic lows, something appeared along the shoreline, a rusted barrel. Inside were human remains. A man shot, likely sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Authorities believe it was a homicide, mob style, dumped in the lake when the water was high, when no one would ever expect to see him again. Except the lake didn't keep him. And now all we can do is sit and wonder, what other secrets does the Hoover Dam hide? Or what other secrets does Lake Mead hide? And really, we'll never know because a lot of them have been buried so far down into concrete in the bottom of a lake.